welcome to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Kentucky attorney Jeff Roberts has over 25 years of experience. He'll provide answers to your questions related to personal injury and automobile accidents, workers' compensation claims, and Social Security disability benefits. Let's join Jeff for this episode. And friends, welcome back. Today, we're sitting in the office with attorney Jeff Roberts. Jeff, how are you?
I'm doing good, Jim. How are you?
Well, buddy, I'm doing fine. This topic is a pretty serious one because it does happen, and unfortunately, maybe a little bit too often. We're going to talk a little bit about multiple vehicle collisions, and obviously with the roadways, with I-24, with the Western Kentucky Parkway, with the Purchase, all this different, even 641, just heading right down to Murray. There's a lot of this that potentially happens, and when it does, they're complicated. And so I thought we might break this open a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. You see different varieties of multi-vehicle collisions that occur. Like sometimes they can be caused by road conditions. Wintertime when roads are icy, you see several multi-vehicle collisions where you've got several vehicles piling on top of each other.
Foggy conditions as well.
Foggy conditions can cause that as well. But then you also see it in situations where basically a lot of times it's one driver not paying proper attention and somebody comes to a slow to make a left turn into a driveway or even a right turn into a driveway, and they're not paying attention to the car ahead of them, and then they may hit the car in front of them, cause somebody to go into the other lane, and then you have multiple collisions in those type of settings as well.
Yeah, the ones I always think about are you hear about it out in California where they've got a 14-car pileup on the interstate, and it always amazes me but when it happens quickly, I think, and especially when you have weather conditions like you said at the beginning, things are going to happen. So the question I've got is just a non-attorney is, who's to blame? How do you figure it out, and what happens?
Sometimes it can be very difficult to determine who's to blame. And a lot of times in the multi-vehicle collisions especially, there's more than one party to blame. And in Kentucky, one of the things about Kentucky law that is, I think, a good thing about Kentucky law is Kentucky has what legal terms is called pure comparative fault. What that means from a practical standpoint is if you're involved in a collision that's a multi-party collision, the jury can look at all the parties' conduct and determine who's at fault and hold multiple people at fault. And if if there's 5 different people at fault, each of them is 20% at fault for causing somebody's injuries, then they each pay 20% of that person's damages. If the person who's injured is 20 or 25% or even 50% at fault, then they cannot recover that percentage that's attributable to them, but the fault attributable to another driver who's at fault in causing the wreck, they're responsible for that. So if you're 50% responsible, you pay 50% of the damages. If you're 5% responsible, you pay 5% of the damages. And that's some states aren't that way, but I think that's the way it ought to be.
Well, and that just really complicates it because, of course, everybody's going to say, well, I had the green light. I had the right. All these things are going to come in. And you may actually believe that until, again, sometimes driving, unfortunately, we're on autopilot and we're just not really paying attention.
True. And in these type of collisions, you can have, frequently you will have multiple people who are at fault in causing the collision. There's one that I was involved in where it was a semi-truck going down the interstate. Road conditions were bad. It had been icing, snow and ice on the road. The semi-driver was going too fast for the conditions and lost control, jackknifed their vehicle in front of another passenger vehicle. The passenger vehicle tried to avoid the collision, was not able to avoid colliding with the semi truck, but then people behind them were caught. There were multiple wrecks. They got that my client was in the passenger vehicle, and really in the damage bore this out. When they struck the semi, they were just nearly to a complete stop at the time they struck the semi, and it didn't stop for a few seconds when another car slammed into the back of them, and then the car hit the back of that car, drove it back into them again, and you had multiple collisions even behind that.
Wow.
From that situation. I think that it was on 24, and if I recall correctly, because there were actually a couple of other semis involved in it, I think around 8 or 9 vehicles total in that before things finally got stopped as far as people hitting other vehicles. And it was icy conditions, time of the day made it difficult to see, and people just driving way too fast for the conditions was a big part of that. And in that case, multiple people were at fault. The semi driver was at fault. My client was partially at fault because he should have been a little further because of the road conditions behind. But then the other drivers behind them, same thing. They were driving too close, driving too fast for the conditions, and couldn't stop. And so you had multiple people that were at fault in causing that collision.
Well, and that's what, I've always heard the assumption that if you rear end somebody, you're assumed to be at fault because you were probably either distracted or following too closely. But when you get into this kind of situation, your vehicle could actually get pushed into the car in front of you. So it's a little different, I would think.
True. You hear people say all the time, well, if you rear end someone, you're automatically at fault. That's not Kentucky law at all. But a lot of times you are. But there are situations where you may not be. If it's a real sharp curve and somebody just stopped dead in the road right around that curve, and you come around that curve and they're stopped and there's no reason for them to be stopped in the road, then they're at fault, because in Kentucky you cannot just stop in the roadway for no reason whatsoever. So, if they're stopped to make a left-hand turn and there's oncoming traffic, that they have a legitimate reason. If they're stopped there because they saw a deer out in the field and they wanted to see how big its antlers were, that's not a legitimate reason to be stopping dead in the roadway. So those...
Well, it is called a parkway.
Huh,
it is called a parkway.
It is called a parkway.
Doesn't hold up under the law.
Doesn't hold up under the law, no. So that is, a lot of times if you rear end someone because you were driving too close, you weren't paying attention, situation, and a lot of times you probably are at fault, but not always. It's not. There's no law that says if you strike the other person's back bumper, you're automatically 100% at fault. You have to look at the facts, and that's in these type of cases, and you have to look at all the facts, and in these cases especially. You have to most likely get an accident reconstructionist involved who can look at the damage to the vehicles to tell to some extent which wreck caused what damage to it, but also vehicles now, nearly every one of them on the roadway now has what's commonly called to as a black box. Event data recorder is the proper name. But you can download that information. An accident reconstructionist can tell you a variety of information about that vehicle and what that vehicle was doing before the collision occurred. You can get speed and braking and things of that nature, whether a person's wearing a seatbelt or not wearing a seatbelt. A lot of them record that information. So, and that can help to determine, if somebody's going, if it's icy conditions, they're on a road that's 70 miles an hour and they're going 70 miles an hour, they may not be exceeding the speed limit, but they're exceeding what is safe for those road conditions, which can cause them to be at fault in the collision.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I've always tried to, see how you guys do this, because this is the CSI aspect, if you will, of being an accident attorney. Is that you've got to then figure out which injury was caused by which collision, right? So if I came to a stop behind that semi, let's say I'm car number one,
Right.
right? And maybe I tap them a little bit. I've got a little bit of damage and maybe a little bit of, I don't have any significant injuries. But the car behind me, car number two, comes riding up and hits into me, again. And then car number three, again, trying to figure that out just seems like it's so complicated.
It can be extremely complicated from that standpoint, and sometimes you have to not only have accident reconstructionists, but biomechanical experts come into play, medical experts come into play on which accident caused what injuries, and sometimes you can't determine exactly which one caused what injuries. Now, if you have one accident that causes just a little, no real damage, and then the next vehicle in line slams into the other one and then slams back into you, and you can determine then, okay, that's probably the accident that caused the significant injuries, not the first little type accident from that standpoint. But sometimes it's just really hard to determine which one, and then you kind of apportion according to who's at fault in causing the collisions to some extent. So.
Wow. You had talked about, even in a neighborhood, someone, quickly tries to turn into a driveway or a parking lot or whatever. Just they make a turn left or right, and you're not anticipating. So sometimes you might instinctively try to swerve out of the way, and then suddenly now you're facing oncoming traffic, and that's a whole other situation.
It is, and sometimes unfortunately, I have seen this, and where on a 2-lane road, somebody pulls up and instead of turning into their driveway and getting out of the roadway, they pull up, and then the passenger in the car is getting the mail out of the mailbox, and so they're stopped in the roadway. A car coming up behind them that expects them to be turning and is not paying as good of attention as they should, realizes, hold on, they're not turning out of the roadway, they're stopped, and then hits their brakes, and a lot of times, unfortunately, they'll swerve into the other lane. They may clip the car that stopped, but then all of a sudden they're in front of a car going the opposite direction, and that causes another major collision. And I've actually had a very similar scenario to that I resolved 2021, I believe, is when I resolved that case. And in that situation, the person who stopped in the roadway to check, without turning, instead of turning into their driveway, was at fault. The other car was at fault. My client, the facts bore out that my client was driving the speed limit, and at the time of the collision, or at the time the other person come out, there was really nothing my client could do. Huge ditch on my client's side of the road. If they turned right, if they turned to the left, they would have hit head on with the car that was stopped, and they got hit head on by the other car from that situation. And so you can have, unfortunately, those type of situations that occur in rural areas and on 2-lane roads. These are not just major thoroughfares like I-24, I-69, Pennyroyal Parkway, those type of situations that can occur even on the rural roads.
Well, I'm going to put some links in the show notes. You talked about, a lot of times there may be a tractor trailer involved, and we have a lot of big truck activity all throughout this region. And you did an episode a while back on safe driving tips around tractor trailers. I always think that's a really good episode, so I'll definitely link there. And then some of the other issues that come up is, we have a lot of farm implements. People, a combine going down the road, a tractor hauling stuff. You've got a truck hauling a big trailer,
Right.
All sorts of different things, and those come into play because you're just not anticipating it typically.
Well, in this time of the year, of course, harvest is getting ready to occur, started in some areas from that, and you do have that. In springtime, you have the equipment on the roadway from planting, and June, wheat harvest usually in June, and then late beans planting then.
It's almost like you're from around here.
It's like I'm from around here, like I've worked on a farm sometimes in my life. And of course, this time of the year, you've got combines, you've got grain trucks coming out on the roadway, you've got uh, tractors and trucks pulling scaffold wagons with tobacco, and all of those are going at a slow rate of speed from that standpoint. And it can be, that can cause people who are not paying attention to end up either running into the rear end of the slow-moving farm implement or crossing over into the other lane, causing a wreck from that standpoint. So that does occur this time of the year in this area, unfortunately, and I see it occur way too often, to be honest. But and sometimes, combines are, they've got, and tractors have gotten bigger over the years, and they sometimes protrude out into the other lane. And so, it's not necessarily the other driver's fault. Sometimes the operator of the equipment is the one who's at fault in causing the collisions.
Right, and of course, trying to prove that is, again, we get back to that CSIX.
Exactly.
It's just it's amazing what you guys are able to do. A few months ago, we did record an episode on traffic fatalities, and it's a horrible situation. But I'll link to that in the show notes as well. If your family member has been involved in a traffic fatality, especially multi-vehicle, pileups and things like that, take some time to listen to that, because there's some things you probably ought to know. And I think you did a really nice job on that without going into areas that are just emotionally difficult. I mean, there's a lot of information that people need to know about.
Yes, those are some of the most difficult cases that I handle from that standpoint. And it hadn't been that long ago that we did that episode, and it's just I always I just hate it when any family has to go through something like that.
Yeah, it's difficult. So let me ask you this. You talked about some of the different types of experts that you might bring in. You want to kind of go over kind of what their role is. You talk about a biomechanical expert. What does that person do?
Biomechanical expert is a person who will, what they do is they look at the forces involved in a collision to say, okay, these are the forces that were exerted on the car, on the human body in this direction, and they can help to differentiate that this collision caused those injuries or likely caused those injuries. You have to have a person with a medical degree to say this was caused by the collision, but what they can do is say, okay, excuse me, this person, you see them a lot with seatbelts, and they can say, if I see insurance companies use them to try to say that if the person had been wearing the seatbelt, these injuries would not have occurred. But they can also be, especially in multi-vehicle collisions, they come in handy on saying, okay, the forces from this injury would not have fractured a bone. But the forces from the second impact that were significantly greater, and that's probably what caused the person's broken leg or broken arm or whatever it is that they may have fractured, or the whiplash injury or whatever it may be. But they will talk about the forces and then not necessarily say Jim's injury was caused by this collision, but saying the type of injury Jim received. These type of forces would cause that. Those type of forces from this other impact would not cause it. Ultimately, then a medical doctor would look at that and then say which accident they felt was the one that caused the injuries.
But again, it's a piece of that process of putting the puzzle together and trying to figure out what actually occurred and who might have been responsible for that particular injury, if you will.
Yes, exactly. That's
Okay.
what you're using those individuals for, is for that determination.
And then the other type of expert that you mentioned was an accident reconstructionist. Kind of what's their role and how do they do that? I mean,
Accident reconstructionist is they're used frequently to help determine who's at fault in causing a collision. They can determine where for instance, I've used accident reconstructions to determine exactly where on the road the collision occurred, which lane that the original impact occurred in, because sometimes when you go look, after the cars meet, especially going at high rates of speed, after the initial collision, they both go in different directions. And so you got to determine, and you can have gouge marks and things of that nature on both sides of the roadway.
Tire
And
skid marks, all that
skid
stuff.
marks and things of that nature. So an accident reconstructionist can go to the scene, document the scene, and then use their equipment to determine where the first impact occurred to help determine who's at fault in causing the collision. So, if the impact occurred on my client's lane, then we know the other driver had crossed the center line into my client's lane to travel. From that standpoint, if my client is on the other side, then I know my client's the one at fault in causing the collision. So that accident reconstructions, I mentioned downloading the event data recorder. They are able to do that and get the speeds of vehicles from that standpoint. So and they can, depending on the training of the accident reconstructionist, some of those can also look at the damage to the vehicles to help to determine some of these. If now we don't have to do that quite as much because more and more vehicles, I think every vehicle now that's been manufactured now has an event data recorder. 20 years ago they did not, so you had to have some crush. They would use crush data and say, okay, this was crushed this distance, so we know the speed of the vehicle was 50 to 60 miles an hour at the time of impact, and you could help you use that to determine speed with the event data recorder. It's not as needed as much because that tells you what the speed of the vehicle was.
Right, and once again, that's that little black box that the cars have.
Yeah, they're called a black box, but sometimes, by the time an attorney gets involved, the vehicle may be gone.
Right, right.
And I was involved in one several years ago now where after the collision, that the vehicle the person who was driving it was here from another country. They were a student and here from another country, and that vehicle got shipped back to that other country. And,
Wow.
Kind of think I know why it got shipped back to the other country, but with my client's vehicle, we didn't have the event data recorder for the vehicle that caused the collision, but we had my client's vehicle, and my accident reconstructionist was able to determine that from that vehicle what the speed was of the driver who did in fact run the red light in that situation. So.
Wow. And a lot of this comes down to trying to prove negligence, trying to prove who really was at fault for which phase of the collision or multiple collisions there. A while back, we did an interesting podcast episode on the rights of a passenger. The passenger wasn't driving. The passenger, wasn't steering the wheel or anything like that. They were just kind of riding along. And those passengers have rights, and sometimes those are additional claims, obviously, that are going to come into play. And that's a real, again, just layers and layers of complicated facts.
Exactly, and that earlier we talked about in Kentucky the jury can apportion fault, and sometimes in a collision, both if it's just a two vehicle collision, both drivers could be potentially at fault in causing that collision, and the passenger is not at fault. So they get 100% of their damage. It may be 25% from one driver, 75% from the other driver's insurance.
That's a good point.
From that standpoint, but also even in just a lot of times people think, well, it's a single vehicle accident, so there's no claim there. The driver, that very well may be true, but if you're a passenger, then you do have a claim even in a single vehicle collision. So.
Wow. Well, Jeff, again, we talked about a lot of times this could be due to inclement weather. This could be due to maybe somebody just stopping where they shouldn't have stopped. But you've got a lot of other issues that, we talked about farm implements and larger operating equipment that could be in the roads that you just have to move around. And then you've got the issue with, I think you said it, a deer, near the area or that darts out in the road. And that happens a lot, especially in this region of the state. When that happens, I mean, things are going to get squirrely really, really quickly. That was not a mixed metaphor, okay? But it's where you've got trucks trying to avoid the deer, or a passenger car trying to avoid the deer, and next thing you know, you've got a lot of bad stuff happening very, very quickly.
Correct. Yeah, and unfortunately, I've seen situations where people swerve to avoid a deer or a squirrel or something like that in the roadway, and then cross the center line and cause a collision, or lose control and cause a single vehicle accident.
Right. That's a good point.
From that situation. So all of those situations, living in a rural community, you're going to have animals get out in the roadway: deer, dog, squirrel,
Cattle.
yeah,
Horses.
Yeah. Now, those situations, they're not supposed to be in the roadway, so you potentially got a claim against the farmer, whoever owns the horse or the cattle, because they're supposed to be enclosed or kept up from that situation. But yes, those do get in the roadway as well, and that's part of where an attorney comes into play, is knowing all the different avenues. If to make sure that the client's injuries and the client's medical bills, client's lost wages, and future medical and future lost wages and pain and suffering are all compensated and taken care of.
Not to mention the property damage to the vehicle itself.
Exactly.
You get a lot of that comes into play. Yeah, I know a lot of people are kind of worried. Well, I don't want to sue people. Well, yeah, but if you're not at fault, sometimes somebody's got to replace the damage and pay for the medical bills. So it's not, you're not doing it maliciously, but I mean, sometimes fair is fair, and if you want to foot the bill, I guess that's your option. But
exactly,
so
and
wow,
and I hear people say that, and I understand where they're coming from that standpoint. But what's always surprised me is if they have kids in the neighborhood playing baseball, and one of them throws a baseball through the window. Well, they want that window replaced, and they would raise a stink over that. But then when they're injured in a car wreck from somebody else's negligence, they want their car fixed, but they're not as concerned about their own bodily injury. And to me, your body is a whole lot more important than property is, or an inanimate object. But from that standpoint, it's you can be not really forced into it, but you can get yourself into trouble if you don't know what you're doing, because your health insurance has paid some of the medical bills, and if they find out that potentially it's third parties at fault in it, if you try to resolve it, or say, well, I don't want to sue them, I'm going to take what the insurance company, if the insurance company offer me a small amount, yeah, my damages are worse than that, but I'm not going to sue the person, and that the person, the person's insurance company is going to be the one paying the bills and your damages from that standpoint. But if you settle for a small amount because you don't want to sue, and then your health insurance finds out that you settled for $5,000, they paid $10,000 in medical bills, you could be in trouble, because not only could they get that $5,000 back, but technically they could potentially come against you for even more.
Wow, that's an aspect of this that a lot of people just don't even really think about. But it's a contract you have with your insurance company. It's a contract that's out there, and really, it's not you're suing your neighbor. You're not suing this other person. You're just filing a claim against an insurance company for something that's been paid for. So
right.
Hopefully that people think a little bit differently about it. And I think when that $40,000 medical bill shows up, I think that does unfortunately cause you to change your mind in some situations.
Yes, and in Kentucky, we've talked about the coverages multiple times. I won't go through those again, but the medical payment part of the coverage, the PIP coverage under Kentucky, has not gone up in several decades, and it does not.
Mid-70s, I think.
Mid to late 70s, 77, 78. And, the medical bills have gone up, and so that $10,000 doesn't go nowhere near as far as it used to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Jeff, let me kind of bring this back. We're talking really about multi-vehicle collisions, and again, these can happen in neighborhoods, they can happen in city streets, and they can happen out on the interstate. The issue is you've got to be careful You've got to be alert. And, I'll put a number of links. I know I've referenced it at various times throughout the episode, but I'll put some links to distracted driving type issues and other things. So, I mean, if you're in that kind of situation, Jeff, you've been practicing for over 30 years. You've done injury-related cases for over 30 years, so you've got a good handle on this. And now you've got two offices. In fact, we're here in Christian County today. We're actually broadcasting out of your Hopkinsville office. You want to talk about those two offices and the best way people can get in touch with you?
Sure. Yes, I have offices in Murray, Kentucky, and I have offices in Hopkinsville, Kentucky. And I meet with clients at both of those offices there. I have one phone number. I think it's a lot easier just to have one number. And instead of multiple numbers, it's just easier to get hold of me. I do have an 800 number as well, but the best way to reach me is by phone, and that's to call 270-753-0053, or if you're out of the area and you want to avoid any long-distance charges, you can call 1-800-844-5108 as well from that standpoint, and then we can set up a time that we can meet in person at either one of those offices, or if you're I do handle cases, all car wreck type cases all over Kentucky, so we can set the case up to where or set up the meeting to be by video conference or just a phone meeting, whatever you prefer from that standpoint, if we can't do an in-person.
Well, and that brings up a good point because, if these accidents are occurring, these collisions are occurring out on the interstate, there's a chance you don't live in Kentucky. You're just coming through, the state on your way to somewhere else, and so you get into a collision here, but you're probably going to go home and try to, heal back at home. You can still handle that case, correct?
Yes, and have several times from that standpoint, and that is true. Yeah, I've had clients whose accident occurred in Kentucky and they lived in Alabama or Indiana or something of that nature, or Tennessee frequently, because Tennessee's not far from where I practice, and that occurs frequently from that standpoint. And if the accident occurs in Kentucky, then you need a Kentucky attorney or an attorney licensed in Kentucky to handle that case. And so that it's better to reach out to somebody that's licensed in Kentucky if it's a Kentucky case. So.
Right. And once again, you also have your website, jeffrobertslaw.com. There's a contact us page right there. It's a nice little form. They can fill that out pretty quickly, and that'll go right to you and your team, and somebody will get back to them ASAP.
Yes.
Yeah, good deal. Well, Jeff, thanks again for sharing your time. I know you're busy. I know we try to do these about every other week, and it's you're running all over the place. Every time I talk to you, you're going to different cities because, like you said, you do end up working on cases all across the Commonwealth. And again, these types of situations, nobody plans for them, but when they happen, it sure is nice to know there's somebody that knows what they're doing and can take on those cases and is willing to sit down and talk to somebody.
Yeah, and I've done it for 30 years, as you mentioned, from that standpoint, and it's just I wish nobody needed my services, but I'm glad I'm there when they do.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff Roberts, once again, thanks a lot, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Take care.
You.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to the Roberts Law Office Injury Podcast. Jeff will return in 2 weeks. Until then, he invites you to visit jeffrobertslaw.com and follow his firm on Facebook. At the Roberts Law Office, you'll find a history of small town service and big city results.